Star Trek: Farewell to Arms. Chapter 2. What Remains. Asterios sat across from Admiral Oridanis, the closest thing he ever had to a father, a man who believed in him before Asterios believed in himself. And he was offering him a command, a starship, something he had longed for when he was a younger man. But now, he looked around his office and tapped the top of his desk. He was in the one place in the galaxy that was truly his. He looked to the empty red espresso cup before looking back at Oridanis. "I don't think that's very wise, Admiral," Asterios responded after a few moments of consideration. "It wasn't just the atrophy of command that comes with the consistency of running a relatively safe station that lacked the dynamic requirements of a starship captain. It was his judgment, his hatred of Klingons, his blaming of them for the deaths of his crew and his brother 5 years ago, and his buried and persistent anger towards not just them, but the Federation, who did nothing. He never wanted to be in that position again. It wasn't that he didn't think he could command. He was doing that right now on Epsilon, but he didn't trust himself in a situation like his short command on the Armstrong. "I disagree. You're exactly who I need for this posting. Your record as the executive officer of the Armstrong, and here speaks to your command style and leadership to run a tight and professional ship. It's precisely what the Hemingway needs," Oridanis returned. "Commanding a ship is far different from being an executive officer and the commander of a space station," Asterios countered. He didn't want to tell Oridanis his real reason, primarily because it was unbecoming of a Starfleet officer to hold such anger and emotion. He was supposed to be better. He knew he was wrong, but he felt the anger was one of the few things that connected him to his brother. Oridanis watched his face as he answered. He was deciding whether to press as his father figure or as his commanding officer. He chose the former. "Asterios, I know the last time you were in command, you were taking over for your brother. I know that's hard. I remember reading reports that you spent as little time as possible in the captain's chair while commanding the Armstrong. And there isn't a chair on Epsilon. You're not in a place where everyone looks to you the same way. So tell me, why don't you want this posting? I'm asking as your friend, not your commanding officer." Asterios paused. "I am worried about being in that kind of situation again. I might have made the right call then, but I'm not sure I can do it again. I was driven more by anger than by tactical sense. I wasn't a leader. I was a vengeful brother. I wanted to make them pay." He looked away from Oridanis, back to the espresso cup, down at one of the pads on the desk, then met Oridanis's eyes again. Oridanis contemplated for a few moments. "That's a natural part of command. It's stressful and can be an emotional job. Your crew relies on you, but a good commander doesn't let those emotions control them. Instead, they can use those emotions to make sound decisions. Good leaders aren't devoid of emotions. If they were, every ship would be commanded by the main computer," Oridanis explained. Asterios heard, but he didn't listen to what Oridanis said. "Hear me out before you decide whether to take the posting." Asterios nodded. Oridanis continued. "There are a few reasons I want you on the bridge of the Hemingway. First, the Centaur class needs to prove its role to Starfleet. It needs to show it can be a multi-role workhorse, like the Miranda class was to the Constitution class. The Hemingway's upcoming mission is to continue exploring core ward near, but not in, the Romulan neutral zone, and to proceed further into the Beta Quadrant toward the Typhon sector. Starfleet Command wants a ship that isn't so large as to be mistaken for a warship, like the Excelsior class, but still large and armed enough to defend itself," he explained. Asterios was following, but he had questions. "There's more to it than that," he probed. Oridanis set down his coffee. The Armstrong was a science vessel. It had no business surviving that encounter. Your command saved the ship and its crew. I need a captain who can do that with the Hemingway if it's in a similar situation. You know how to make the hard calls, to improvise when everything is on the line," he told Asterios as his commanding officer, not as his friend. Asterios was quiet for a few moments. It was a bitter pill to swallow. He was relieved this was coming from the Admiral and not his friend. "You want to give me a ship because of the worst day of my life?" Oridanis narrowed his eyes at Asterios' attempted deflection. "I'm giving you a ship." Oridanis paused, slightly disappointed. "Because of what you did on the worst day of your life. There's a difference." If Asterios was bitter about the first statement, this one was worse. He wanted to move to a different topic, but though he'd had time to process his grief and rage, he hadn't. He understood it wasn't healthy. He didn't care. "Why isn't Commander Voss being promoted as the captain of the Hemingway?" Asterios pivoted away from the current topic. Oridanis now did the same thing Asterios had done, looking at the coffee mug before looking back at him. "She is a good commanding officer," the Admiral started. He pulled out a small datapad and handed it to Asterios. He took it and reviewed it. It was a log of officers who had turned down transfers off of the Hemingway, easily 24. Asterios looked up. There is a load-bearing sized but to follow that statement. Asterios continued to review the datapad. Oridanis nodded. "But the Admiralty doesn't believe she's ready to become the captain of the ship. As you can see, her staff have refused alternative postings, transfers and, on some occasions, promotions, all of which would have taken them off the USS Hemingway." Asterios was surprised to see that one of the junior officers refused a transfer to the Enterprise B, the flagship of Starfleet. No officer would pass on that. "What is happening on this ship?" he thought to himself. "They're too close. It's a family, not a crew." Asterios diagnosed the problem before Oridanis could tell him. "Exactly. They've been primarily running the Hemingway and the Centaur class through its paces within Federation space, serving as a support vessel. But if this crew goes to the frontier as this next mission requires it to do so, they're going to have to start making hard calls." Asterios looked back up at Oridanis. "And they're going to get themselves killed. It's easy to follow orders when the orders are easy, when there is no danger, no stakes." Asterios was already acting like a commander. Oridanis nodded. "You need someone to come aboard who is an outsider and introduce real discipline, real hierarchy, to change it from a family back to a crew." Oridanis sipped his coffee. "That is exactly what the Admiralty would like you to do. Take the discipline and order that you have brought to Epsilon Station and impose it on the Hemingway." Asterios set the datapad down. "That's a pretty tall ask." "Why do you think I came to you first?" Asterios didn't like that. It was a little trick Oridanis had learned to manipulate him. "I would need time to think about it." This surprised Oridanis. Asterios was always the brasher of the two brothers, the confident little brother with something to prove, even if he didn't acknowledge it. The Asterios I knew 5 years ago would have jumped at the chance to command his own starship. Asterios grimaced. 5 years ago, I had my brother. Oridanis' face fell with concern. He knew pressing right now would have disastrous consequences for their relationship. He simply sat in silence for a few moments. Asterios regretted saying that to Oridanis, but it did come from a real place. This conversation, its blending of the professional and personal lives, had made it significantly more difficult. Before they could continue the conversation, the communicator on the desk beeped. Asterios, looking for an out of this situation, resented himself and then pressed the button. "This is Commander Ferdinant." "Commander, we have an emergency. You're needed in the command center," Gorf stated. "Understood. I'm on my way." He stood before the comm had fully closed. The grief didn't go anywhere, but something older moved in front of it. This was a perfect excuse to end the conversation, but feelings stayed with him as he reached the door. He was already running the problem, a muscle he'd forgotten. He looked at the Admiral, who met his eyes. "Admiral, we'll continue later. I am needed on the CIC." He was back on solid ground. Oridanis nodded. "Of course." He followed Asterios out of his office and toward the CIC. Asterios and the Admiral entered the command center from the right and descended to the command table. Gorv informed them of the situation. A damaged vessel was detected on the edge of their sensor range. Ops, bring it up on the display. Communications. Are we able to hail them? The table display moved to the very edge of the sensors. It was a refitted Kumari-class Andorian battlecruiser. They are not responding to hails, Commander. We are receiving only an automated distress signal, the communications officer replied. Asterios looked to Gorv. He answered the question Asterios was about to ask. The vessel is too far out for our tugs. Asterios looked to Admiral Oridanis, then back to Gorv. Thankfully, we have a fully crewed starship. He looked at the communications officer. Locate and inform Commander Voss that we need her help. She acknowledged and made a call over the station speakers. He looked to the science officer. What are our long-range sensors telling us? They are heavily damaged. They barely have impulse power and life support, he responded. The communications officer turned and looked at Asterios. Commander, we have located Commander Voss. She's already on the bridge of the Hemingway. Put her on the view screen. Asterios looked over to the screen as it displayed Commander Voss. She was already standing when the view screen connected, the bridge arranged around her the way a crew arranges itself around someone it trusts completely. It was a near-carbon copy of the Excelsior Bridge. Commander, we've picked up the Andorian science vessel as well, she said. We're already beginning to undock to provide assistance. Asterios nodded. Good. You're ahead of me. We'll need the Hemingway to get it close enough for our tugs to bring her into our repair bays. But we don't know what could be out there, so I would advise you to go to yellow alert with your shields up until within tractor beam range of the ship, he explained. Lieutenant Sharanek, he called out to Gorv. Do we have confirmation that this is the IGS Shashpar? Gorv nodded. Yes, sir. The transponder is reading that. She waited for Gorv to finish. Do you think a yellow alert is necessary? It was a fair question, but it didn't feel like it was coming from that place. The IGS Shashpar was resupplied on Epsilon just a few weeks ago. While it was mostly outfitted for science, it retained most of its updated weaponry. I don't want whatever attacked it to threaten the Hemingway, he explained. Understood. She nodded to Ops, who changed their standing to yellow alert, the lighting on the bridge changing. Helm, take us there. Maximum warp. She walked back to the captain's seat. She turned around and sat. Engage. He looked down at his table as he zoomed it out to see the Hemingway exit the sensor profile of the Epsilon station and then rocket out to the edge of their sensors, exiting warp a few thousand kilometers away from the ship. Asterios looked up to see Voss with a look of horror. We're patching through our sensors, she said. The view screen changed to the Kumari-class battlecruiser, which hung dead in space like a broken blade. Her distinctive twin-pronged hull was now scored with deep impact burns and jagged breaches running along her port nacelle housing. A slow, luminous bleed of plasma vented from what remained of her warp engines, the energized gas catching the starlight in sickly pulses of blue and violet that drifted and dissipated into the void. Jesus, Asterios said under his breath. It was a far cry from the pristine vessel that had left only a few weeks ago. Whoever did this was trying to send a message, not just disable the vessel. If that's what she looks like, I'd hate to see what she was fighting, Gorv stated. Asterios pointed at the screen towards the luminous trail it was leaving. Lieutenant, we can't bring her aboard Epsilon if she's leaking plasma. We're going to need to pull out her core before we can bring her in. Gorv nodded. I agree, Commander, but if we pull it, we don't know if she'll have enough power for life support in that condition. Asterios knew he was right. There was no way they could save the ship. Not like this. He paused, thinking it over. He looked to Oridanis. He hated that this was turning into a test. It wasn't his ship to make that call about. He made it anyway. Hemingway, saving the ship is now a secondary objective. Our primary objective is the crew. You need to start beaming them over immediately. The view screen changed back to the bridge of the Hemingway. My engineering crew thinks that they can stabilize and eject the core. We can then tractor beam the ship to Epsilon. Beaming your crewmen aboard only puts more lives at risk, We don't know the extent of the damage nor how stable the warp core is. We need to save the crew and then decide what to do, Asterios explained. There was another pause. Voss knew he was right, but for the second time he'd disrupted the plans she had in motion. You're right. We'll proceed as directed, Commander. Ops, tell Transporter Bays 1 and 2 to begin beaming the Andorian crew aboard, she ordered. The science officer turned to Asterios. Commander, I'm picking up fluctuations in their warp core. Asterios looked back at the view screen. Hemingway, are you getting the same readings I am? The world had narrowed to the two of them working as commanders of their respective crews to resolve this crisis. He had forgotten that Oridanis was there. He wasn't needed, so he was removed from the crisis. He was running on pure instinct and training. Voss glanced at her own science officer. We are, Commander. Asterios was impressed. Her crew moved with her like a single instrument, but he could see what Oridanis had told him. No crew works this closely without being too close. We just got the last of their crew, Voss reported. Get to a safe distance, Asterios ordered. But it was too late. The vessel exploded. The view screen went dark. Asterios looked down at the display table to see the sensors capture the explosion as it washed over the Hemingway. He feared the worst as his heart sank. He looked to the communications officer. She was working hard to restore communications. The silence lasted 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity before communications were re-established. The bridge of the Hemingway appeared on the view screen again. We're all right, Commander. We were able to raise our shields at the last second. Only minor damage, Voss reported. Good work, Commander Voss. Bring the Hemingway back in. We'll get her fixed up, Asterios said with a small smile. She was surprised by the praise. Of course, Commander. All in a day's work. Thank you for your assistance as well, she said genuinely. Oridanis stepped forward. We'll have a full debrief once you're back on the station. As Commander Ferdinant already stated, good work out there. Voss nodded slightly. Understood, Admiral. She looked off-screen to her communications officer, and the view screen went dark. Asterios stood there, looking down at the display table, then at Oridanis. I'll do it, but I need more information, and I have conditions, Asterios told Oridanis. Oridanis looked at him for a long moment. We should continue this in a conference room, not your office. Asterios nodded in agreement. They arrived in the primary command conference room, a deck below the CIC. Asterios walked to the window to look out at the same stars that had comforted him for the past 4 years. He waited for Oridanis to speak. You handled that crisis well, Commander. It's exactly what we need. The Shashpar wasn't a pushover, and whatever they encountered out there is something that the Hemingway could encounter. Asterios sighed. They were cataloguing astrometric data on some of the stars and systems on the very edge of the Typhon sector, he explained. He understood that this signaled the dangers that lay on that frontier, and that if he didn't do this, he would likely be sending the Hemingway's crew to their deaths, and he couldn't accept that. Oridanis nodded. I know, I read your reports. We both know whatever attacked them left them alive on purpose. It's a signpost. Don't come here, Asterios stated. So there are some other things I need to tell you about the mission. First, I'll be assigning a science officer to the Hemingway, Lieutenant Nara Vell. She's a civilian-turned-Starfleet officer. 14 years of independent research on that frontier before she joined up 14 months ago. The most experienced scientist we have on the Typhon sector. Her information about Romulan activity out there exceeds anything our own reconnaissance can produce, Oridanis explained. I don't entirely trust her, but she's the best person for the job. He held out a datapad to Asterios, who was still looking away. He finally turned and took the pad. He looked over her record. She had an impressive number of published papers and dissertations on the sector. The other complication is that Colonel Katal will also be joining the Hemingway as a liaison from the Klingon Empire. He is the foremost expert on Romulan battle tactics and technology. I have a working relationship with him. I had just requested his research, but it quickly evolved into him requesting to serve as a liaison officer or not getting the research, and knowing the proximity of the Romulans, I couldn't have you going in blind." Asterios hated this, but he hid his opinion from Oridanis. This time he was handed a Klingon datapad. It was about the same size but a different color, green, and slightly asymmetrical and square to the rounded corners of a Starfleet one. Katal's academic record was formidable. Asterios only glanced at it. "All right, I want to bring Lieutenant Sharanek with me to the Hemingway," Asterios requested. Oridanis thought it over. "Done." Asterios was surprised it was that easy, but he understood that what he was signing up for would hardly be straightforward. He had a lot of healing to do. Perhaps he would find it on the Hemingway, as he wasn't able to do so here on Epsilon. They looked at each other. They both, without saying so, agreed to finish the other conversation another time. There was a chime at the door. Oridanis turned towards it. "Come in." Voss entered and looked at the way the two stood near each other, and that Asterios was holding two different datapads. She looked at Asterios one last time before looking directly at Oridanis. "Admiral," then looked to Asterios. "Commander." They both greeted her. Oridanis led the debrief. It was efficient and professional, and Voss matched it. What she couldn't quite match was the ease between the two men. Not casual, nothing so simple as that, but worn in, the kind of shorthand that doesn't perform itself. She registered it and left it alone, as she didn't yet have enough information to interpret it. When it was done, they settled around the table, and Oridanis moved on. The room atmosphere shifted slightly. Oridanis looked at Voss. "Commander Voss, I am placing Commander Ferdinant as the captain of the USS Hemingway." Voss took it well, at least from Asterios' perspective. She lingered on him a moment longer than the situation required before looking back at Oridanis. "Understood, Admiral." Then back to Asterios. "I look forward to working with you." He believed she meant it. He wasn't sure that made it easier for her. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more of Star Trek: Farewell to Arms on the Outer Almanac.